once again, and today I'll be doing a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier analysis video on Jinzos and Amazements. Starting off with Jinzo, basically an archetype based around Jinzo, and their whole gimmick is shutting down trap cards. Anyways, let's get started. For the pros, this deck has decent monsters. Also, this deck has good spells. As much as I hate I've got the name of it, but basically it gives your opponent the option to set a spell card, and if they decide to set a spell card, you get a special summon Jinzo, but for obvious reasons that's kinda dumb because your opponent most likely won't even do that. They'll just allow you to search Jinzo, which is almost useless because it's like, if you don't have a way to get that Jinzo onto the field, then what's the point of having it in your hand? But there are ways of getting it onto the field, like the other level 6, or at least, I guess, other 2 level 6. Because I think one special summons Jinzo from the hand, but your opponent would have to control a trap for you to be able to do that. You see where the problem lies in this deck, right? Also, the other plus is this deck can destroy trap decks. Now for the cons. This deck lacks enough Jinzo monsters. This deck lacks versatility because, like, outside of popping a card with that one really good quick play spell, all you're going to be doing in this deck is just shutting down traps, which would suck if your opponent isn't really playing traps. And speaking of, this deck folds to decks that play little to no traps. Because most decks in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! They're not going to play that many traps. Granted, traps are making somewhat of a resurgence, but for the most part, not so much. So if your opponent is playing mostly spells, or no traps at all, or even if they're playing a few traps, they might not even, like, if they know that you're playing Jinzo, they'll just play around that. Like I mentioned, like that card something into the Cosmos, I think that's the name. Your opponent's just simply going to opt not to set a trap from their deck. Because it'd be stupid if they, did that. And because this deck's win condition revolves around stunning your opponent's trap cards, that's just not enough for Jinzo. Oh wait, technically they do have versatility because their Xyz monster, I think, steals monsters. They have a quick play that pops cards, and they can shut down traps, but how often are you going to get to the quick play, and how often are you going to summon that rank 6 and meet its conditions? And how often are you going to shut down trap cards in this deck? This deck lost 2 Monster Gate because, this deck was already struggling even prior to Monster Gate going back down to 1, but now that it's at 1, yeah, the chances of you actually getting Jinzo onto the field are a lot slimmer than previously. And this deck usually can't play through more than 1 negate. For the stats, I give this deck a 2.5 out of 5. Because Jinzo is still a fairly beefy monster, plus like I mentioned, like the quick play spell is really powerful and could also allow you to apply a little bit of pressure. Like, you get to pop a card as well as like beef Jinzo up a bit. And for defense, I'd say it's a 1.5 to a 3 out of 5. And the reason I put it like that is, if you're playing against a trap if you're playing against a trap deck, the defense would be very high. Wow, voice crack. The defense would be very high for, an obvious reason. But if your opponent's not playing a trap deck, your defense is going to be very, very poor and very minimal. And for recovery, I'd give this a 1 or 2 out of 5. And the reason I say that, because again, if your opponent's playing a trap deck and you manage to get Jinzo out, you can basically just get back into the duel, but obviously, what's the chances of that ever happening, especially if your opponent's not playing a trap deck? For versatility, I'd give it, I'd give it a 1.5 out of 5. They have options, but the options are they're not, like, you can't really consistently get to them, especially in most games, so that's why I'd have to give it a 1.5 out of 5. And for consistency, I'd give this deck a 3 out of 5. They have searchers, they have ways of searching Jinzo and special summoning it, assuming your opponent actually is dumb enough to let you special summon it by setting a trap from the deck, but that's neither here or there. Its consistency is just alright. I guess I should have said a 2.5 out of 5, but I gotta throw Jinzo a bone here. Anyways, that's why I'm rating this deck as a tier 3.5 deck. It has decent cards, but its main win condition kind of leaves it open to non-trap decks. Next and lastly, we have Amazement. And Amazement are basically a trap-focused deck. Anyways, for the pros, they have good monsters, like 4 main deck monsters, like Arclano, which automatically good. He special summons himself, he pops things, and he also allows you to set your Amazement trap card from your deck. As well as, I've got B was Bufo. Bufo with normal summon, you get a set. Basically, he's like a marionetter of the deck. And then you have the other two, like Kamika and Delta, which are like somewhat decent cards, I guess. Anyways, this deck has good traps. This deck also has decent protection because a lot of your traps also interfere with your opponent, as well as some of your traps actually protect your monsters from certain types of effects. But this deck has 4 main deck monsters, so the chance of you actually equipping your own monster with something like this is somewhat slim. Anyways, this deck has decent recovery because, like I mentioned, this deck has an Altergeist Marionetter. Excuse me. Yeah, they basically have an Altergeist Marionetter, so you can basically just set a trap card and... the problem with this deck is the fact that it is slow, so you'd probably have to wait a turn, and if they do manage to stop your Bufo, if they do manage to stop your Bufo, your recovery isn't really going to be all that smooth. But you'd probably have ways of making sure it goes off. And also, this deck is fairly consistent because you have the ticket, which basically allows you to search, I think, any of your amusement cards, amazement and amusement cards, and you could also, Bufo also allows you to get to most of your trap cards, I think. And this deck can also play things like trap tricks, so it's pretty easy to get to the traps you want to get to. So that's why this deck is incredibly consistent. This deck is fairly versatile because they have cards that flip opponents' monsters face down, steal opponents' monsters. They even have Arcaleno, who allows you to pop monsters, and you also have spells and traps that... you do have spells and traps, but the spells, for the most part, suck. But you have traps that could also pop your opponent's spell and traps. Basically, this deck has a toolbox of effects that you can utilize. And for the cons, this deck is generally good going first. Going second is not going to be fun. And this deck usually can't play through multiple negates. Now for the stats. For power, I'd give it a 2 out of 5. For defense, a 3.5 out of 5, mostly because of the soft interactions you can set up first turn. For recovery, I'd give it a 3 out of 5. For versatility, I'd give it a 3 out of 5. Probably should give it a 3.5 out of 5, to be completely honest with you. And for consistency, I give it, I don't know why I put 2.5. I was incorrect when I put that. I would give it a 3.5 out of 5. Also, I was joking about the crack thing for obvious reasons. I feel like I had to specify that so I don't potentially get in trouble with YouTube possibly in the future. I don't know. YouTube likes to make dumb rules and retroactively enforce it, so I'm just covering my tracks here. So overall, I'd give this deck. I'd say that this deck is tier 3. It's decent and has the potential to be good, but due to it being trap focused and due to their trap cards not really floating like Eldritch's traps do, I'd have to put this in tier 3 just because of that. This deck is amazing. They have great effects, but usually by the time you have things set up, usually your opponent just blows through your field or your opponent just ends you before you actually get a chance to counterattack. And this deck is pretty easy to get around. Anyways, tell me what you guys think about Jinzos and Amazements. And it's been me, your boy Blue Getziga, and I'm out.